The sun was slowly rising over the rugged hills of Macedonia. A cool morning breeze moved gently through the olive trees, and the golden light of dawn touched the stone walls of the royal palace. Inside those walls lived a boy who would one day change the history of the world. His name was Alexander the Great. At this moment, however, he was not yet the conqueror of empires. He was simply a young prince, restless, curious, and filled with questions about the world beyond the mountains of Macedonia. Alexander had already shown signs of greatness. His courage, intelligence, and determination were clear even in his early youth. But his father, Philip II of Macedon, believed that strength alone was not enough to rule the world. A king needed wisdom, and wisdom could only come from knowledge. Philip II wanted his son to be more than a warrior. He wanted him to become a thinker, a strategist, and a leader whose mind was as powerful as his sword. So he searched for the greatest teacher in the Greek world, a man whose knowledge seemed limitless, a man whose ideas would shape philosophy for centuries. That man was Aristotle. Aristotle was already famous throughout Greece. He had studied under the legendary philosopher Plato in Athens, and he had developed his own powerful way of understanding the world. Unlike many philosophers who focused only on abstract ideas, Aristotle studied everything: nature, politics, science, medicine, animals, logic, human behavior. To Aristotle, knowledge was not limited to one field. The entire universe was a giant puzzle waiting to be understood. Philip II believed that if anyone could shape the mind of young Alexander, it was Aristotle. So he invited the philosopher to Macedonia with an extraordinary offer: teach the prince, guide his mind, and help prepare him to rule the world. Aristotle accepted. Soon, a special school was prepared for Alexander, and a small group of noble boys who would become his closest companions. The school was located near a quiet place called Mieza. It was far from the noise of the royal court. Here, surrounded by trees, rivers, and open landscapes, the young students would learn about philosophy, science, and leadership. This was no ordinary school. It was a training ground for the future rulers of Macedonia, and perhaps unknowingly, for the future rulers of much of the known world. When Aristotle first met Alexander, he immediately noticed something extraordinary. The boy's eyes were full of intensity. He listened carefully. He questioned everything. Most students simply memorized their lessons. But Alexander wanted to understand. He wanted to know why things worked the way they did, why nations fought wars, why some leaders inspired loyalty while others failed, why some civilizations rose to greatness while others collapsed. These questions fascinated Aristotle. He realized that this young prince possessed a rare combination of curiosity and ambition, the perfect foundation for greatness. So the lessons began. But Aristotle did not teach like ordinary teachers. He believed that knowledge should not be forced into the mind. Instead, it should be discovered through discussion and exploration. Often, Aristotle would walk with his students through the gardens of Mieza while they talked about philosophy. They discussed the nature of courage, the meaning of justice, the responsibilities of a king. Aristotle taught Alexander that a ruler should not only conquer lands, he should also build civilizations. A king should promote learning, culture, and law. These ideas deeply influenced Alexander. Years later, when Alexander built new cities across Asia and Egypt, he would remember the lessons he learned here. But philosophy was only one part of the education. Aristotle also introduced Alexander to the epic poetry of Homer. Among all the works of Greek literature, one story captured Alexander's imagination more than any other: the heroic tale known as the Iliad. This epic told the story of the Trojan War and the legendary warrior Achilles. Achilles was fearless in battle, swift and unstoppable, but he was also proud, emotional, and driven by honor. Alexander saw himself in Achilles. The story inspired him deeply. According to ancient historians, Aristotle even prepared a special copy of the Iliad for Alexander. The young prince reportedly kept it with him for the rest of his life, even during his military campaigns. To Alexander, Achilles was not just a hero. He was a model for the kind of warrior Alexander wanted to become. But Aristotle also warned Alexander about the dangers of pride and anger. He reminded him that greatness required discipline and wisdom. Power without wisdom could destroy a ruler. This balance between ambition and restraint became a central theme in Alexander's education. However, Aristotle's lessons were not limited to philosophy and literature. He also taught science. The students studied plants, animals, geography, and medicine. Aristotle believed that understanding nature helped leaders understand the world they ruled. Alexander became fascinated with geography in particular. He wanted to know what lay beyond the known borders of Greece, beyond Persia, beyond the deserts and mountains described in ancient maps. The idea of exploring unknown lands filled him with excitement. Even as a teenager, Alexander began dreaming of distant kingdoms and mysterious civilizations. Aristotle may not have realized it at the time, but these lessons planted the seeds of Alexander's future conquests. The young prince was no longer satisfied with the limits of Macedonia. His mind had begun to imagine a much larger world, a world waiting to be explored, and perhaps conquered. Yet despite the peaceful atmosphere of Mieza, the political world outside was changing rapidly. Philip II was expanding Macedonian power across Greece. Wars were being fought, alliances were being formed, and the young prince knew that one day he would inherit both the throne and the challenges that came with it. His education was preparing him for that moment. Every lesson, every discussion, every story of heroes and empires, they were shaping the mind of a future king. But neither Aristotle nor Alexander could fully predict what the future would hold. Because the boy studying philosophy in the gardens of Mieza would one day become something far greater than a king. He would become a legend, a name that history would never forget. Alexander the Great. The peaceful valley of Mieza had become more than just a school. It had become the place where the mind of a future conqueror was being forged. Every morning as the sun rose over the Macedonian hills, the young students gathered beneath the shade of ancient trees. There, Aristotle would begin his lessons, not with commands, but with questions. "Tell me," Aristotle would say calmly, looking at the young prince, "what makes a ruler truly great?" Most students would hesitate, but Alexander the Great rarely stayed silent. "Power," Alexander answered one morning. "A king must be strong enough that no enemy dares to challenge him." Aristotle smiled slightly. "Power is important," he replied. "But power alone cannot create greatness." Then he asked another question. "What happens when a powerful king rules without justice?" The students thought carefully. Alexander paused. Then he said slowly, "Such a king may conquer lands, but he will lose the loyalty of his people." Aristotle nodded. At that moment, the teacher understood something remarkable. Alexander was not simply memorizing ideas. He was learning to think like a ruler. These conversations became the heart of Aristotle's teaching. Instead of giving simple answers, he challenged his students to debate and question everything. They discussed war, leadership, philosophy, morality, and the nature of ambition. For Alexander, these discussions were fascinating because deep inside him burned a powerful desire to achieve greatness. But Aristotle constantly reminded him of an important truth. A king must first conquer his own mind before he can conquer the world. These words would remain with Alexander for the rest of his life. Aristotle believed that knowledge was the most powerful weapon a leader could possess, so he opened the doors of learning far beyond traditional education. The students studied geography and maps of the known world. They learned about distant lands and unknown peoples. Alexander became particularly fascinated by the vast empire ruled by Darius III, the ruler of the mighty Persian Empire. The Persian Empire stretched across enormous territories, from Asia Minor to Egypt, from Mesopotamia to distant eastern lands. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen. To many Greeks, Persia seemed unstoppable. But when Alexander studied its maps and history, he saw something different. He saw weaknesses. He saw opportunities. The idea that one day he might challenge such a massive empire began to form in his mind. Aristotle noticed this growing ambition, and although he encouraged Alexander's thirst for greatness, he also tried to guide it wisely. Ambition can create heroes, Aristotle once warned, but uncontrolled ambition can destroy them. Alexander listened carefully. But even then, deep within his heart, he believed he was destined for something extraordinary. One evening, as the students gathered around Aristotle, the philosopher opened a scroll containing the epic story of the Iliad. The room grew quiet. Alexander leaned forward with excitement. The story told of the Trojan War and the legendary warrior Achilles. Achilles was fearless, fast in battle, nearly unstoppable. But he was also human, driven by pride, honor, and emotion. As Aristotle read the verses aloud, Alexander felt completely absorbed in the story. He imagined the clash of armies, the sound of bronze weapons, the glory of heroic combat. To Alexander, Achilles represented the ultimate warrior, a man whose courage echoed through history. One night after the lesson ended, Alexander spoke privately with Aristotle. "Do you believe Achilles truly existed?" Alexander asked. Aristotle looked at the young prince carefully. "Whether he existed exactly as the poets describe is uncertain," he replied. "But what matters is the idea he represents." Alexander frowned slightly. "The idea?" "Yes," Aristotle said. "Achilles represents the pursuit of excellence, the desire to achieve greatness that will be remembered forever." Alexander remained silent for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I want to be remembered like that." Aristotle studied the prince's face. He could see the fire in Alexander's eyes, and he realized that this boy was not dreaming of an ordinary future. He was dreaming of immortality through history. During his years at Mieza, Alexander was not alone. He studied alongside a group of young noblemen who would later become his most trusted companions. Among them was Hephaestion, who would eventually become Alexander's closest friend. Their friendship grew strong during these years of shared learning and training. They debated philosophy together. They practiced military skills together, and they dreamed of future adventures. Aristotle encouraged these friendships. He believed that strong alliances were essential for leadership. "A king may stand at the top," Aristotle told his students one day, "but he cannot rule alone." These young companions would later follow Alexander across deserts, mountains, and battlefields. But at this moment, they were simply students, learning about the world and their place within it. As the months passed, Alexander's education transformed him. He was no longer just a prince trained for war. He had become a thinker, a strategist, a student of history and philosophy. Yet the world outside Mieza was changing. King Philip II of Macedon continued, expanding Macedonian power. Battles were being fought. Cities were being conquered. The future king could not remain a student forever. Soon, Alexander would leave the peaceful gardens of Mieza and step into the dangerous world of politics and warfare. But the lessons he learned here would stay with him forever, because the ideas planted by Aristotle would shape the decisions of the man who would one day conquer vast empires, and history would soon witness the rise of a leader unlike any the world had seen before. The years at Mieza were slowly coming to an end. The quiet gardens where young nobles once debated philosophy would soon be replaced by the harsh realities of politics, war, and power. For Alexander the Great, the lessons of Aristotle had transformed the way he saw the world. He no longer viewed kingdoms simply as territories to be conquered. He began to see them as civilizations, cultures, traditions, and people shaped by history. But even as Alexander's mind expanded through knowledge, another powerful force continued to grow within him: ambition. Not the reckless ambition of a reckless warrior, but the calculated ambition of a man who believed he was destined for greatness. And soon, the world outside the peaceful valley would begin testing everything. Aristotle had taught him. One afternoon, a messenger arrived from the royal court. He brought urgent news from Philip II of Macedon, Alexander's father. Philip was preparing for another military campaign, and this time he needed his son. Alexander was only 16 years old, but Philip believed the young prince was ready to face responsibility. When the news reached Aristotle, the philosopher looked at Alexander carefully. "You have learned many things here," Aristotle said calmly. "Philosophy, science, politics, but knowledge alone does not create wisdom." Alexander listened quietly. "The world beyond these gardens will test your judgment," Aristotle continued. "You will face choices that no book can answer." Alexander nodded slowly. Then he asked a question that surprised even his teacher. "What if I fail?" Aristotle smiled. "Failure is not the enemy of greatness," he replied. "The only true failure is refusing to learn from it." These would be some of the last words Aristotle spoke to Alexander as his teacher. Soon, the young prince would leave Mieza and enter the dangerous world of leadership. When Alexander returned to the royal capital of Pella, the atmosphere was very different from the peaceful environment of Mieza. The palace buzzed with political tension. Messengers rushed through the halls. Generals discussed military plans. Philip II was preparing to campaign against rebellious tribes along Macedonia's borders. Before leaving, the king made a surprising decision. he appointed Alexander as regent of Macedonia. This meant that while Philip was away at war, the 16-year-old prince would rule the kingdom. It was an enormous responsibility. Many older nobles doubted that such a young leader could handle the pressures of power, but Alexander accepted the role without hesitation. Inside his mind echoed the lessons of Aristotle. A ruler must be wise. A ruler must be just. A ruler must think before acting. Yet fate would test him almost immediately. Soon after Philip left for war, news arrived that a rebellious Thracian tribe called the Mede had risen against Macedonian authority. They attacked border regions and believed the young regent would be too inexperienced to respond. It was exactly the kind of challenge that could destroy a young ruler's reputation. Alexander faced a critical decision. He could wait for his father to return, or he could act. The prince remembered Aristotle's lessons about leadership and courage. Great leaders do not hide from responsibility. They confront it. So Alexander gathered an army. For many soldiers, this was their first time seeing the young prince command troops. Some wondered whether the 16-year-old had the strength to lead them. But Alexander moved with confidence. He studied the battlefield. He planned carefully. Then he led his army against the rebellious tribe. The battle was swift. Alexander's forces crushed the Mede rebellion and secured the region. But the young prince did something even more remarkable. Instead of simply destroying the rebel settlement, he founded a new city there. He named it Alexandropolis. It was the first city Alexander ever established. Years later, he would found many more across Asia and Egypt. But this moment marked the beginning of that legacy. A 16-year-old prince had proven that he was capable, not only of fighting wars, but of shaping history. When Philip II of Macedon returned and heard about Alexander's actions, he was deeply impressed. His son had not only crushed a rebellion, he had demonstrated leadership, intelligence, and boldness. Philip reportedly said something that revealed how proud he was of the young prince. "My son must find a kingdom worthy of him," he declared. "For Macedonia is too small." At the time, those words sounded almost like a joke. But history would soon prove that Philip's words were closer to prophecy. Even as Alexander began gaining real power, he never forgot the lessons he had learned from Aristotle. He continued studying literature, philosophy, and science. He kept a copy of the Iliad with him, and the heroic spirit of Achilles continued inspiring him. But Aristotle's influence went beyond stories. The philosopher had taught Alexander something even more important. A great ruler must respect knowledge. Years later, during his military campaigns, Alexander would bring scientists, historians, and scholars with him. He would collect plants, animals, and geographical information from distant lands. In many ways, he carried Aristotle's curiosity across the world. By the time Alexander reached adulthood, it was clear that he was no ordinary prince. He possessed courage, intelligence, charisma, and an unstoppable drive to achieve greatness. Yet destiny was moving quickly. Events were unfolding that would soon change the course of his life forever. Because in just a few years, the young prince who once studied philosophy in the gardens of Mieza would face a shocking tragedy, a moment that would thrust him onto the throne of Macedonia. And once he became king, the world would never be the same again. Time continued to move forward, and the boy who once studied quietly in the gardens of Mieza was no longer just a student. Alexander the Great had already proven his ability as a leader. His victory against the rebellious tribes and the founding of Alexandropolis had shown the Macedonian nobles that the young prince possessed both courage and intelligence. But the greatest challenges of his life had not yet begun, because the world of kings and empires is never peaceful for long. The expanding power of Macedonia. During these years, Alexander's father, Philip II of Macedon, was transforming Macedonia into the most powerful kingdom in Greece. Philip was a brilliant military strategist. He reorganized the Macedonian army, creating one of the most disciplined and deadly fighting forces of the ancient world. His famous Macedonian phalanx, a formation of soldiers carrying long spears, became nearly unstoppable in battle. City after city began falling under Macedonian control. Greek states that once resisted Macedonian influence slowly accepted Philip's leadership. Philip's ultimate goal was even greater. He planned to unite the Greek world and launch a massive invasion against the mighty Persian Empire. For generations, Greeks had dreamed of defeating Persia. Now Philip believed the time had finally come, and Alexander watched everything carefully. He observed his father's strategies. He studied military tactics. He listened to generals discussing campaigns. These experiences were shaping him into a future commander. Yet beneath the surface of the royal court, tensions were quietly growing. The Macedonian court was full of powerful nobles, ambitious generals, and political rivalries. Many respected Alexander, but others feared his rising influence. Some believed Philip might eventually choose another heir. These fears grew stronger after Philip married a new Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice. For the first time, the possibility existed that Philip might have another son, one considered a pure Macedonian heir. This created tension between Alexander and some powerful figures in the court. Rumors spread. Whispers of succession struggles filled the palace halls. Alexander began realizing that the world of politics could be far more dangerous than the battlefield. Even so, he remained confident. The lessons of Aristotle had taught him patience and self-control, but fate was preparing a moment that would change everything. In 336 BC, the royal court gathered in the ancient city of Aegae. The kingdom was celebrating a grand festival. There were games, ceremonies, and public celebrations honoring Macedonian power. The atmosphere was filled with excitement. Philip II walked proudly among his people, confident in the strength of his kingdom. But in a single moment, everything changed. As Philip entered the theater, a bodyguard named Pausanias of Orestes suddenly rushed forward. Before anyone could react, he stabbed the king. The attack was swift and shocking. Philip II collapsed. The most powerful ruler in Greece was dead. Chaos spread through the crowd. Some feared a political conspiracy. Others feared civil war. But amidst the confusion, one truth became clear. The throne of Macedonia was suddenly empty. In that moment of crisis, Alexander the Great acted quickly. He was only 20 years old, yet he understood that hesitation could destroy the kingdom his father had built. With the support of loyal generals and companions, Alexander secured his position as the new king of Macedonia. Many enemies believed the young ruler would be weak. Some Greek cities even began planning revolts against Macedonian rule. They assumed that a 20-year-old king could not control the powerful kingdom his father had created. They were about to discover how wrong they were, because Alexander possessed something rare, a combination of courage, intelligence, and ambition that few leaders in history had ever matched. And behind that ambition stood the teachings of his old mentor. The lessons of Aristotle still guided his thinking. Alexander knew that ruling required more than strength. It required vision, and Alexander's vision was far greater than anyone could imagine. As the young king stood at the beginning of his reign, he remembered the maps he had studied as a student. He remembered the stories of heroes, the tales of Achilles, and the vast territories of the Persian Empire. Now the dream of conquest no longer seemed impossible. The throne of Macedonia gave Alexander the power to turn those dreams into reality. But first, he had to secure his kingdom. He had to prove to Greece and to the world that he was worthy of the title his father once carried: king, commander, leader of armies. The student of Aristotle was about to become something far greater, a conqueror whose name would echo through history. And this was only the beginning, because soon, Alexander would begin a campaign that would change the ancient world forever.